So we've got about 15 minutes for follow-up. So realistically, probably 2 questions. So I'm going to give you the second one first so you can think about it, and then I'll give you the first one. So the second one is I would like each of you to respond to something another panelist said. So you can take a little time to think about that while you answer the first question, which is Philip in his book cites as a kind of model of someone who was able to sort of cut through the bureaucracy of the time, Winston Churchill. And obviously that was in a time of war when his predecessors had failed miserably. So a unique historical circumstance, but I think one where we can all agree that he was able to sort of come in and get things done that nobody else had gotten done, and arguably to save the world in the process. I'm curious where each of you, has identified a specific problem. Paul talked about decaying systems, which is a problem but also an opportunity. You talked about the bilge of bureaucratic bullshit in communications. Sally, you talked about taking more of a kind of surgical approach. Nicole talked about the way in which politics sort of gets in the way of all of these things. Do you have models yourself, both in terms of current politicians or people in history who you look at and you kind of say they dealt with the problem that you identified successfully? Paul, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Nicole, you want to start?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. You can do it in any order.
I would start with Jeanette Sada-Khan, who was the Bloomberg-era transportation commissioner. That if you think about pedestrianizing key parts of Manhattan and the outer boroughs, the city has been thinking about doing these things for 50 years, 40 years when Jeanette was there. I mean, the Lindsay administration tried to put a pedestrian mall on Madison Avenue and Fifth Avenue in the early 1970s. And they just got stuck in this bureaucratic morass. The business owners didn't want it, they were sued, the police didn't like it, and they just sort of gave up. And it was kind of an emblem of the multiple failures of New York City during the 1970s. And here, 40 years later, Jeanette comes along, does something that many people would consider impossible in taking away Broadway from Times Square down to Madison Square from cars and trucks. If you tried to get everyone to agree to this, all the business owners, all the hotels, the drivers, the people for and against, the community boards and so forth, you would never be able to do it. And they were sued over some of these projects. They were sued over the Prospect Park bike lane. People said they should do an environmental rule. But she literally overnight took Times Square, the crossroads of the world, put up fences, cut off the cars, and declared it a pedestrian plaza, and did the permanent construction of the plaza over the few years after that. But this was a clear case of, I am going to take accountability for doing this. If it turns into a disaster, I am the person responsible. But in order to do that, she needed backup from the mayor.
What you got? Richard? Or Sally?
I don't have a person, I have a process that I would refer to. One of the allegations is that regulations should be refocused on the goals, not the management. I agree completely with that. That has been the sine qua non for federal significant regulations since the 80s. This came about because people were concerned. There's a performance standard and a design standard for those who have a life. I don't. A design standard tells you what you have to do. A performance standard says, here's what we want you to get to. You figure out how to get there. It has been the guiding principle in the review of regulations at the federal level for significant regulations that you choose performance standards over design standards. That's a process that came about because of concern. And so you recommend it, it's done. You've succeeded. Congratulations. It's been there and it's followed. Can it always work? No. because sometimes you have very ingenious people who will take the objective and devise a way that doesn't fulfill it, but undercuts it. And so you get people who then want to layer on some sort of more micromanagement. But the performance standard rather than design standard came about through this process of learning what needs to be done to be responsive. I can't speak to the state level or the city level, and I can't even guarantee you that it is consistently applied throughout the federal level, but it is a principle that we subscribe to, and that there's always a pushback when an agency goes to, that was my office's job, was to push back. When an agency says, you have to do it this way, we say, why specify the details? Just tell them where you want to end up. Give them some options to do it. Exactly what Philip Howard has been calling for, and it's done in some places, not all.
Richard?
That's very illuminating. I would say in terms of the UN, the two people that I think about who hew to this performance rather than design standard was one of the first Secretary Generals of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who wanted to get things done and could formulate directives in a way that enabled people to try and do that. Dick Holbrooke was also somebody when he was at the UN who, do you know Richard Holbrooke?
Yeah.
Remember him? Who had the same kind of mentality. My comment to Philip is this, is that I think there's a caution that has to be made about empowering people in a bureaucracy, which is something very, and I'll explain it to you as simply as I can in terms of something we're involved in today, which is a triage that we are in dealing with displaced people, a triage we're trying to make between immigrants and refugees. And this is a program we have in both Turkey and in Tunisia, that we privilege refugees for assistance, transport, all of that, over migrants who are economic. This is a very gray area, and it's done on the ground by mostly young UN workers who are making what are really life and death decisions based on feel, questions, sometimes through two sets of interpreters and so on. What we're finding with that is that there's almost the weight of having that kind of responsibility is really heavy for them. And there are high levels of stress, people flip out, they break down because too much responsibility has been loaded on them. And, this is not like, whether you get, this is not trivial. But it's at the point of delivery that what you're talking about can be something that is too much. And a project I'm working on is how to give these people making these essentially life and death decisions in the field, how to give them more of, to relieve the weight of having made that kind of those choices. It's filled with guilt. And I imagine soldiers have the same kind of problem. So this is not, it's not a rosy good empowering people in a system. It's something that has a deep, deep undertow. Taking responsibility for something means you take responsibility into yourself. So I think that's the other side of this.
Paul, do you have any thoughts on
Well,
models?
I would say that in terms of people who work these issues, I thought the Obama administration had a pretty good crew of people who cared about these particular questions that we've got here. Jeff Zients, had strong opinions, and he made clear to Congress. He pounded away on some of these issues. I'm not going to say much about Sally because it would be obsequious, perhaps. I don't know. But it was a good group. I think what we learned from the Obama team at OMB, I'm not talking about personnel management, other agencies and so forth, is that it's Congress that doesn't really think deeply about this. I was sitting here saying, which member of Congress was it that I could point to? And it's been a while. Remember Obama's joke about the salmon, every salmon who swims in salt water is regulated by this, every salmon in fresh water is regulated by that, or regulated by that. Well, salmon are regulated by two different agencies, depending on whether they're swimming in salt water or fresh water. Okay, so it was a good joke, except that he didn't know at the State of the Union, it would have been rude, that every salmon that swims in any water is named by Congress. And until you figure out a way to organize congressional and go through some sort of effort to clarify what Congress is doing, it's been, since the mid-1970s and the Obie Commission that did a fundamental reorganization of the committee structure, and it's time to do it. And some of this swims down from Capitol Hill.